The man nitrogen monoxide of the night had dressed itself in gold. Outside the Marlowe Grand Hotel, the city shimmered the way it only did when something important was supposed to happen. Long black cars rolled up the circular driveway one after another. Camera flashes flickered like distant lightning. Well-dressed guests stepped out, laughing softly, their coats tailored, their jewelry catching the light. Inside, crystal chandeliers spilled warmth over marble floors polished so perfectly they reflected the ceiling like still water. A jazz trio played near the staircase, slow and elegant, as if even the music had been instructed not to disturb the luxury. Tonight was the hotel's 50th anniversary gala, and everything had to be perfect. Evan Caldwell, the general manager, had been on his feet since 6 that morning. He was the kind of man who wore his authority the way some men wore cologne, not loudly, but constantly. His suit was charcoal gray, his hair combed into disciplined place. His jaw always set as if he were permanently dissatisfied with the world's performance. To Evan, the Marlowe Grand wasn't just a hotel. It was his proof. Proof that he had escaped the small town. Proof that he belonged among powerful people. Proof that appearances, if managed correctly, could protect a man from ever being overlooked again. He walked the lobby like a commander inspecting troops, correcting napkin placements, straightening floral arrangements, lowering his voice to scold a bellman whose smile he felt was too casual. Tonight's guest list included studio executives, business magnates, musicians, and donors who wrote checks large enough to rename buildings. Evan had memorized half their faces. The other half he planned to recognize instantly, because the worst thing a manager could do in his mind was fail to recognize someone important. The front doors opened again, and this time no one turned their head. The man who stepped inside looked misplaced. He wore a faded brown coat that had known better decades, simple dark sweater, and shoes that had been polished many times but would never be mistaken for new. His hair was neatly combed, silver at the temples. His face carried lines, not the kind carved by stress, but the kind shaped by long years of smiling, laughing, and listening. He paused just inside the entrance, allowing the warm air to settle around him, taking in the glow, the music, the quiet murmur of expensive conversation. For a moment, he simply stood there, not lost, not confused, just observant. Guests flowed past him in tailored gowns and tuxedos, barely glancing. A server nearly brushed his shoulder and murmured a quick apology without meeting his eyes. To most of them, he registered as background. Another older man? Another early arrival? Maybe someone's driver who wandered too far. But to Evan Caldwell, he registered as a problem. Evan noticed him from across the lobby, standing near the fountain, hands folded loosely in front of him. The coat, the lack of a visible invitation. The way he wasn't being greeted by anyone. The way he didn't belong to any obvious category. Not staff. Not guest. Not donor. Not press. Evan felt the familiar tightening. In his chest, this hotel's image depended on control, and this man was. Uncontrolled, Evan crossed the marble floor quickly, his polite expression already preparing itself like a mask being pulled from a pocket. Up close, he saw the stranger's eyes. Calm, bright, curious, they carried no nervousness. No apology, only patience. "Good evening," Evan said, his tone pleasant but edged. "May I help you?" The man smiled gently. "Good evening. Beautiful place you have here." Evan nodded once. "It is, and tonight is a private event. I don't seem to have you on our guest list." "It wouldn't surprise me," the man replied easily. Something about the answer unsettled Evan. There was no scramble, no embarrassment, no reaching for proof, just acceptance. As if not being on the list didn't diminish him in the slightest. Evan straightened. "These events are by invitation only. May I ask who you're here with?" The man glanced around the lobby, the musicians, the towering arrangements, the guests gathering near the ballroom doors. "With memories," he said after a moment, "and a bit of curiosity." Evan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He was not in the mood for riddles. "Sir, If you're waiting for someone, you're welcome to do so outside. We need to keep this area clear for our guests." The man studied him then. Not challengingly, not submissively, just thoroughly. As if Evan were a painting he was deciding how to describe. "I understand," the man said. "I only hoped to walk around a little first." "I'm afraid that won't be possible," Evan replied. His voice cooled. "This isn't a public lounge tonight, and, respectfully, you don't belong here." The words landed heavier than Evan intended. They always did, for the first time. Something shifted in the man's expression. Not hurt, not anger, something quieter recognition. He nodded slowly. "People have been telling me that for a long time." Evan gestured toward the entrance. "I'll have one of the attendants show you out." "It won't be necessary," the man said. "I can find the door." He turned, unhurried, and began walking back toward the entrance. As he did, a few guests finally noticed him, not because of who he was, but because of where he was going. Some looked briefly curious, some indifferent. One woman frowned, assuming he must have wandered in by mistake. Evan watched him go. A small, relieved exhale leaving his chest. Problem handled. Atmosphere protected. But as the man reached the doors, the jazz trio song came to a natural end, and in that tiny pocket of quiet, a voice rang out from the ballroom entrance, loud, clear, disbelieving. Double quotes. "Dean." The man stopped. Slowly he turned, and everything in the lobby began to change. The name that froze the ROM for a fraction of a second after the name was spoken. Nothing seemed to happen. The word didn't echo. It didn't explode. It didn't crash into the room the way people imagine big moments do. It simply hung there, suspended in the warm air of the Marlowe Grand's lobby. Delicate and uncertain, as if even the sound itself wasn't sure it had permission to exist. "Dean?" The voice had come from near the ballroom doors. A woman in a midnight blue gown stood half-turned, one hand lifted to her chest. Her face pale with something that looked dangerously close to disbelief. Her eyes were locked on the man. By the entrance, the man who had just been told he didn't belong, the man who had almost stepped back into the cold. "Dean." Martin turned slowly, not dramatically, not with flair. There was no practiced reveal in the movement. He turned the way a man does, when an old friend calls his name across a crowded street calmly, with quiet attention, as if he were more interested in the person than the effect. "Yes," he said. The woman inhaled sharply, as if the sound of his voice had confirmed something her mind had been afraid to hope. "It is you," she whispered. "Oh my God. It's really you." Around her, a few nearby guests began to look more closely. Faces shifted, brows furrowed, heads tilted. People leaned slightly, so adjusting the focus on an image they had previously dismissed as unimportant. Dean gave a small, polite smile. "Good evening." The woman moved first. She crossed the space between them quickly, heels forgotten, grace abandoned, and reached for his hands. "They said you weren't coming. They said you don't do these things anymore." "Most of the time I don't," Dean replied gently. A man beside her stared openly now. Then another. A ripple of attention spread through the lobby like a drop of ink in water. People who had been mid-conversation trailed off. A few phones were lifted instinctively, then slowly lowered again, as if recording suddenly felt disrespectful. One man murmured, "Is that?" Another said, "It can't be." But then Dean laughed softly, and the sound cut through uncertainty like sunlight through fog. It wasn't loud. It wasn't theatrical. But it was unmistakable. Recognition hit the room in stages. A collective recalibration. Spines straightened. Expressions rearranged themselves. Whispers multiplied, then overlapped, then blurred into a low, growing murmur that no amount of crystal or marble could contain. Dean Martin. Why is he dressed like that? Why didn't anyone announce him? Is this some kind of entrance? And standing only a few steps away, Evan Caldwell felt the floor tilt. Beneath his certainty, he had not moved from where he stood. He had not yet spoken, but every sound now seemed to rush past him, without touching him, as though he were suddenly separated from the room by invisible glass. His eyes were fixed on the man near the doors. On the profile, on the easy posture, on the smile that now belonged unmistakably to someone he had seen on screens and magazines. In framed photographs hung in expensive offices, Dean Martin, not a look-alike, not a tribute. Performer, not a story. Him, Evan's mind scrambled backward, replaying the last 2 minutes with brutal clarity. The coat, the words, the gesture toward the door. You don't belong here? A faint heat crept up his neck. No, Evan whispered, though no one was listening. The woman was speaking animatedly now, still holding Dean's hands. You can't imagine what this means. My father. He built half his confidence listening to you. He played your records every Sunday morning. He would have lost his mind if he knew you were here tonight. Dean's eyes softened. That's very kind of you, she laughed weakly. Kind? You were the soundtrack of his life. More guests had gathered closer, forming an unintentional circle. A few nodded in recognition. Some smiled. Some simply stared, as though afraid he might disappear if they blinked too long. Dean noticed Evan then, or rather, he noticed the stillness. The way one man stood rigid while the rest of the room leaned in. Dean excused himself gently and took a few steps back, toward the center of the lobby. Toward Evan. Evan felt him before he heard him. Are you all right? Dean asked. The question was simple, human, unaccusatory. It made Evan's throat tighten. He stopped, restarted. I didn't realize, sir, Mr. Martin. Dean is fine, he said. Evan nodded too quickly. Dean, I didn't know who you were. I thought that you were protecting your space, Dean finished calmly. Yes, Evan said, relief flaring. Exactly. That's my job. Dean smiled again, but this time it wasn't quite as light. It's a difficult job. Deciding who belongs where? Evan swallowed. Around them, the crowd hovered, pretending not to listen and failing completely. The music had not resumed. The lobby had become something else now, not a reception area, but a moment. I didn't mean any disrespect, Evan said. If I offended you, I apologize. Dean studied him. Not the suit, not the title, the man. You didn't offend me, Dean said. But you reminded me of something. Evan hesitated. Of what? Dean glanced around the room at the chandeliers, the gowns, the careful beauty, then back at Evan, of how quickly we learn to measure people by the doors they enter through. Evan felt that same faint heat again. Only now, it had reached his ears. I grew up in places where no one expected much, Dean continued quietly. Where if you didn't look like success, you weren't listened to. Where men with good hearts cleaned floors while men with sharp shoes were called important. I was told I didn't belong more times than I can count. Someone in the circle inhaled softly. I worked hard, Dean said. I was lucky. I was loved by people I never met. And one day, the doors opened for me. But I never forgot what it felt like to stand on the wrong side of them. Evan lowered his gaze. I didn't come tonight to be seen, Dean went on. I came because this place. He looked toward the ballroom. This hotel used to have a small lounge in the back, 40 years ago. A piano that was always out of tune. I sang here once when no one was paying attention. The bartender was my only audience. Few guests exchanged surprised looks. He slipped me a drink after, Dean said. Told me, kid, if you keep singing like that, you might make it somewhere people will remember you. Dean's voice softened. I wanted to see if he was still here. The room felt suddenly smaller, more intimate. I didn't know the hotel had changed so much, Dean added, or that belonging had become so exclusive. Evan's chest tightened painfully. I'm sorry, he said, and this time the words carried weight. I truly am. Dean regarded him for a long moment. Then he nodded once. Thank you. The jazz trio slowly, hesitantly began to play again. A low, gentle melody. Something nostalgic. But the real tension had only just begun. Because across the lobby, near the old service hallway, an elderly bartender stood frozen. And when his eyes met Dean's, they filled. The man who never left at the far edge of the lobby, where the light softened and the marble gave way to shadow, an old man stood behind a small portable bar that had been set up for the gala overflow. He hadn't moved since the moment the name was spoken. Dean, his hands were resting on the counter. But they were no longer steady. One of his fingers twitched faintly, as if his body were trying to convince itself this was real by sending small signals back and forth. His white jacket hung loose on his thin frame. His hair, once black, was now a careful arrangement of silver strands. On the left side of his face, near his eye, a faint scar curved downward like a forgotten parenthesis. His name was Samuel Ortega. Most of the guests thought he was part of the catering staff brought in for the evening. Some assumed he was temporary. Some hadn't noticed him at all. But 40 years ago, Samuel had poured drinks in a small back lounge of this very hotel when it was not yet grand, not yet famous, not yet a place where power liked to gather and admire itself. Back then, it had been a quiet corner, and Dean Martin had stood there, young, unknown, nervous in the way men only are before life decides whether to be kind. Samuel's throat tightened as memory surged, up with the force of something that had been waiting decades to be felt again. He remembered the way the boy's hands had trembled slightly over the piano keys, remembered how only 3 people had been in the room, remembered how he'd stopped wiping the counter because the voice had caught him off guard. Not because it was perfect, but because it was honest. Because it carried something bruised and hopeful at the same time. He remembered pouring the drink. Afterward, remembered leaning forward and saying, "Kid, if you keep singing like that, you might make it somewhere people will remember you." He had said it casually like men do, but he had meant it. Now the boy stood in the center of a palace built of light, and Samuel felt the years press suddenly into his chest. He took one step forward before he realized he was moving, then another. Each one was heavier than the last. Guests parted without understanding why, drawn aside by something in the old man's face that made instinct override etiquette. His eyes never left Dean. They glistened now, though no tears had fallen yet. His mouth opened once, closed again, as if he were afraid the moment might shatter if he named it. Dean felt him before he saw him. There is a way people feel when someone who truly knows them enters a room. A subtle shift in the air, a quiet pressure behind the ribs. Dean turned slowly, and there he was, smaller than memory, thinner, older, but unmistakable. Dean's breath caught. For the first time that evening, the calm loosened. "Sam," he said. The name trembled. Samuel stopped 3 feet away. Neither man spoke. The lobby seemed to draw inward, the way a theater does when the lights dim, when even those who don't know the story sense that something real is about to be said. "You," Samuel tried. His voice failed him. He swallowed hard. "You're here." Dean nodded once. His eyes were bright now, too. "I was hoping you'd be." Samuel let out a sound that was half laugh, half breath. "I thought I'd finally lost my mind." Dean took a step closer. Then, without ceremony, without performance, without the slightest concern for who might be watching, he wrapped his arms around the old bartender and held him. The movement was simple. The effect was not. Samuel's hands rose slowly, hesitantly, then pressed into the back of Dean's coat as if anchoring himself to something solid. His shoulders shook once, then again. The tears came quietly, slipping down the deep lines of his face, disappearing into the fabric. "I kept that piano tune," Samuel whispered hoarsely. "I never learned it right, but I kept it." Dean closed his eyes. "I never forgot your voice either." Around them, silence deepened. Some guests lowered their heads. Some covered their mouths. A woman near the staircase wiped her eyes without realizing she was doing it. Evan Caldwell stood a few steps away, completely forgotten, and for the first time in a very long time, he was grateful for that, because what was unfolding in front of him was not an embarrassment, it was an exposure. Dean released Samuel slowly, keeping his hands on the old man's shoulders. "They told me you retired." "I tried," Samuel said. "Didn't take. Too many years talking to people, too many stories left in the walls." Dean smiled faintly. "They let you stay?" Samuel nodded. I don't manage anything. I don't train anyone. I just pour when they ask. Clean when they forget. Stand where I've always stood. Dean looked around. You're standing in a palace now. Samuel shrugged gently. It's still just a room. Dean studied him, then reached into the inside pocket of his coat. He pulled out a folded piece of paper worn thin at the edges. I found this, he said softly. Samuel's eyes narrowed as he leaned closer. It was YELLOWED, on it. Written in a careful, uneven hand were lyrics. Samuel's breath stuttered. You kept that? Dean nodded. I never wrote another song without remembering where the first one came from. Samuel pressed his lips together. I didn't come tonight to be seen, Dean said quietly. I came because this place is celebrating 50 years. And because no one celebrates the men who make rooms feel like beginnings. He glanced briefly, almost unintentionally. Toward Evan, Evan felt the look land, not accusing, accounting. Accounting double quotes. I wanted to thank you, Dean continued, for treating a nobody like a somebody before the world told you to. Samuel shook his head faintly. You weren't a nobody, Dean smiled. Neither are most people. They just get spoken to like they are. The words hung, and in them, Evan felt something crack. He had built his career on surfaces, on polish, on separation, on quiet assumptions about who needed protecting and who needed removing. He had told himself it was professionalism. He had told himself it was order. But standing there, watching the most recognized man in the room hold the least noticed one like an equal, he saw his reflection, and he did not like what it showed. Dean turned slightly, his voice rising, just enough to carry. This hotel is beautiful, he said. But beauty isn't what makes a place matter. Memory does. Kindness does. The way you speak to someone when you think they can't change your life. Every eye in the lobby was now fixed on him, and sometimes, Dean added, the people we asked to leave are the ones who built the doors. Silence pressed in. Not. Empty, heavy, alive, Evan's chest tightened painfully. He took one step forward before he knew he meant. To Dean, he said. Dean turned. Evan hesitated, then did something he had not done in this building in years. He removed his jacket. I told you that you didn't belong, Evan said, his voice steady but low, and I was wrong. But more than that, I spoke to you the way I've spoken to 100 people whose names I never bothered to learn. He glanced around, and for the first time I can hear how that sounds. The room waited. I don't want to be that man, Evan said. Dean studied him quietly. Then don't be, he replied, and in those two words, the night shifted. The door that stayed open for a long moment after Dean's words. No one moved, not because they were waiting for permission, but because something rare had settled over the lobby, the kind of silence that isn't empty, the kind that feels like a held breath. The chandeliers still glowed. The music had softened to a distant murmur. Glasses still clinked somewhere far behind. But in the space where Dean, Samuel, and Evan stood, time itself seemed unsure how quickly it was supposed to go. Evan. Caldwell was the first to act, not as a manager, as a man. He turned. Not toward the ballroom, not toward the donors, not toward the staff, but toward the front doors. The same doors he had gestured toward minutes earlier, the same doors he had silently used to divide those who belonged from those who did not. He walked to them and pulled them wide open. Cold air rushed in from the night outside, brushing across the warm lobby like a reminder of the world beyond velvet and marble. Guests turned in confusion. A few attendants stiffened. I'm sure if this was some part of the program. Evan faced the room. When this hotel was built, he said, his voice carrying farther than he expected, it wasn't meant to be a museum for the successful. It was meant to be a shelter for travelers, a place where anyone who crossed the threshold could breathe easier than they did outside. He paused. I forgot that. He looked at the staff first, the servers, the porters, the quiet workers who kept the building alive without ever being announced. Some stared back, some lowered their eyes, some straightened as if hearing their names spoken without sound. "I don't want a single person in this building to ever feel invisible again," Evan said. "Not to me. Not to anyone who wears this emblem." He removed the small silver pin from his lapel, the one every senior manager wore, and held it in his palm. "I don't deserve this tonight," he continued, "but I want to earn it." Then he turned back to Dean and Samuel, "And I want to start by saying thank you for reminding me who this place was supposed to be for." The room felt different now, not like a stage, like a gathering. Dean watched him for a long moment, then nodded once. "That," he said quietly, "is how places change." Evan stepped back, and for the first time all evening, he was not at the center. Dean glanced toward the musicians. They had been watching in stillness, instruments resting against their knees like paused voices. Dean lifted one hand. "Would you mind?" he asked gently. If an old man borrowed a piano for a moment, a breath moved through the lobby. The pianist stood at once. It would be an honor. Dean walked slowly toward the small grand piano near the staircase. It wasn't the centerpiece instrument of the ballroom. It was there for atmosphere, for elegance, for the suggestion of music rather than its demand. But as Dean sat, the room rearranged itself without instruction. People turned their bodies. Chairs were shifted quietly. Samuel stood just to the side, hands clasped, his eyes never leaving Dean's back. Dean placed his fingers on the keys. For a moment, he didn't play. He simply rested them there, feeling the cool surface, the slight resistance, the familiar promise. Then he began. The first notes were simple, unadorned. They carried none of the polish of performance. They carried memory. It was the melody. Samuel had kept the tune no one else had ever learned quite right. A hush moved through the lobby as the sound filled it, not loud, not commanding, but unmistakably alive. Dean's voice joined after a few measures, softer than any recording had ever captured, textured with years, with gratitude. With distance traveled, he sang of doors, of nights, of standing outside places that glowed, of being invited in not by wealth, but by one human voice saying, "Stay." Some guests closed their eyes, some held their breath, some felt tears arrive before they understood. Why Samuel pressed one hand to his mouth. Evan stood near the open doors, feeling the cold air on his back and the warmth of the room in front of him, realizing with sudden clarity that belonging was not something you guarded, it was something you gave. When the last note faded, no one applauded. Not at first. The silence that followed was too full. Then one person placed a hand to their chest, another whispered, "Thank you." And slowly, gently, the lobby rose into sound. Not thunder, not spectacle, something truer. Dean stood. He did not bow. He turned to Samuel. "Come," said Samuel, hesitated, then stepped closer. Dean took his hand and guided him to the piano bench. "Play it with me." "I'm not," Samuel started. "You are," Dean replied. Samuel's fingers shook as he placed them on the keys. Dean began again. This time, the melody wove to lives together, past and present, seen and unseen. The hotel no longer felt like a building. It felt like a witness. When the final note ended, Dean leaned close to Samuel and whispered something only he could hear. Samuel nodded, tears tracing the deep lines of his face. Dean turned then. Addressing the room, "I don't know how many years any of us get," he said. "But I know this. The smallest kindness outlives the loudest applause. The way you treat the person who cannot change your life changes yours." He looked briefly toward Evan, then back to the guests. "Keep your doors beautiful," Dean said, "but keep them open." He stepped away from the piano, and without ceremony, without escort, without any desire to be followed, he walked toward the night. Evan moved instinctively to open the door wider. Dean paused beside him. "Thank you," Evan said. Dean met his eyes. "For opening it," then he was gone. The doors remained open long after the cold should have mattered, because no one inside wanted them closed.